the 17th of January 1945. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence. Not the gentle drift of a winter's peace, but the smothering blanket of war, a white shroud over broken trees and frozen earth. In the pre-dawn darkness, the forest was a cathedral of skeletal branches, each limb weighted with ice that cracked and whispered in the wind. The temperature had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. Men who still breathed did so in short, shallow gasps, their lungs burning with each inhalation. The air tasted of cordite and pine sap, of blood gone cold in the snow. Somewhere in that frozen wasteland, among the shattered remnants of an American reconnaissance platoon, a young sergeant named William Preston lay motionless beneath the corpses of his own men. His face was pressed into the snow. Ice crystals had formed in his eyebrows, in the stubble along his jaw. Blood, not all of it his own, had frozen across his uniform in dark, irregular patterns. 3 bodies lay atop him, their weight crushing the breath from his chest in measured intervals. He could feel their cold seeping into his own flesh, could smell the copper tang of their wounds mixing with the sharp scent of evergreen. And he could hear, with terrible clarity, the voices of the German soldiers moving through the carnage, speaking in low tones as they searched for survivors. He did not move. He did not breathe. He became stone, became snow, became one more broken thing in a forest full of broken things. This was the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, a massive counter-offensive launched through the Ardennes in mid-December with 250,000 German soldiers and hundreds of panzers. The Americans called it the Bulge because of how the German advance had pushed deep into Allied lines, creating a dangerous salient that threatened to split the British and American armies in two. For the Germans, it was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a name that carried all the weight of their national mythology, all the desperate hope that they might yet turn the tide of a war they were losing on every front. The forest itself had become a graveyard. The snow, which should have been pristine, was churned into pink and crimson mud where men had fought and died. Equipment lay scattered like the toys of angry children, rifles with shattered stocks, helmets with holes punched clean through, ammunition belts trailing across the ground like rosaries abandoned mid-prayer. The trees bore their own wounds, bark stripped away by machine gun fire, branches hanging at unnatural angles, sap frozen in amber tears along their trunks. Preston's platoon had been sent forward 2 days earlier with orders to probe German positions near the village of Butgenbach. 23 men, most of them barely old enough to vote, led by a lieutenant fresh from officer candidate school who still believed in the glory of war. They had moved through the forest in tactical formation, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, their boots crunching through snow that was sometimes knee-deep. The lieutenant had consulted his map every 100 yards, his hands shaking not from fear but from cold, his fingers so numb he could barely fold the paper. They had walked into an ambush at dawn on the 16th. The Germans had been waiting in prepared positions, their machine guns sighted to create intersecting fields of fire, their mortars already ranged in on the likely American approach routes. They had learned this kind of warfare in Russia, had perfected it through 3 years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. They knew how to kill efficiently, how to maximize casualties with minimum exposure. They had let the American platoon walk deep into the killing zone before opening fire. The sound had been apocalyptic. Machine guns hammering in long, sustained bursts, the crack and boom of mortars walking their explosions through the American formation. Men screaming, some in pain, others in fear, a few simply screaming without words because sound was the only thing left to them. Preston remembered the lieutenant trying to organize a defense, his voice high and breaking as he shouted orders that no one could hear over the gunfire. He remembered seeing Private Kowalski, the kid from Pittsburgh who was supposed to get married in June, take a round through the throat and go down clutching his neck as blood fountained between his fingers. He remembered Corporal Davis trying to drag a wounded man to cover and catching a burst from a Maschinengewehr 42 that nearly cut him in half. Preston had returned fire, his M1 Garand bucking against his shoulder as he squeezed off shots at muzzle flashes in the trees. The rifle's distinctive ping as the en-bloc clip ejected was a sound he heard even through the chaos, a small mechanical note in a symphony of destruction. He had seen several Germans fall, though he couldn't be certain his bullets had been the ones to kill them. The distinction seemed meaningless. Everything was fire and noise and the desperate animal need to survive. Then something had struck him in the side with the force of a sledgehammer, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. He didn't remember falling. One moment he was standing, firing, and the next he was on his back staring up at the grey sky through gaps in the canopy, his ribs screaming with a pain so intense it whitened the edges of his vision. He had tried to rise and found he couldn't. His body wouldn't obey. Blood was spreading across his uniform in a warm, wet stain that steamed in the frozen air. Others fell around him. On top of him. The lieutenant landed across his legs, his chest torn open by shrapnel, his eyes still open and staring at nothing. Private Henderson collapsed beside him, his face pressed against Preston's shoulder, his final breath a long, rattling sigh that Preston felt more than heard. The weight of the dead became a shelter, a gruesome camouflage that hid him from the German soldiers who moved through the carnage in the aftermath. He had heard them coming closer, their boots squeaking in the snow. They had been talking among themselves, their voices carrying that particular tone of men who have just survived combat relief mixed with residual adrenaline, the forced casualness of soldiers pretending they hadn't been afraid. One of them had laughed at something, a harsh sound that seemed obscene in that place of death. Preston had felt a boot prod. One of the bodies covering him had felt the weight shift and settle. He had remained absolutely still, his eyes closed, his breathing stopped, his entire being focused on the single imperative of playing dead convincingly enough to live. The Germans had been thorough. They moved through the killing ground methodically, checking bodies, collecting weapons and ammunition, searching for documents or maps that might contain useful intelligence. Preston heard the distinctive clicks of bolts being worked, the occasional short burst of gunfire as wounded Americans were dispatched. One man had been crying, pleading in English for his life, his words dissolving into screams and then into silence. Preston had forced himself not to react, not to move, not to reveal by even the smallest tremor that he was still alive. They had taken prisoners. Preston heard them rounding up the survivors, perhaps 5 or 6 men who had been too badly wounded to resist or who had surrendered in the hope of living. The German voices had become businesslike, issuing orders in clipped phrases. Preston had heard men being ordered to stand, to drop their equipment, to move. He heard the sounds of a column forming up, boots crunching through snow, equipment rattling, and then they had moved off, taking their prisoners with them, leaving the dead to the forest and the falling snow. Preston had waited. The cold was becoming dangerous now, seeping through his uniform, through his skin, settling into his bones with a deep ache that was almost worse than the sharp agony of his wound. The bodies covering him provided some insulation, but not enough. He could feel his extremities growing numb, could feel that dangerous drowsiness that precedes hypothermia beginning to cloud his thoughts. But he waited because moving too soon would mean death as surely as freezing would. The day had passed with agonizing slowness. The snow continued to fall, accumulating on the bodies, on Preston's exposed hand, on the rifles and equipment scattered across the ground. The forest was silent except for the wind moving through the branches and the occasional crack of ice-laden limbs breaking under their own weight. Once, he heard distant artillery, American guns firing from positions to the west, the sounds rolling across the landscape like thunder. Later, he heard aircraft overhead, though whether they were friendly or enemy he couldn't tell through the cloud cover. He thought about his family in Indiana, his father, who had worked in a steel mill and who had shaken Preston's hand when he enlisted, his grip firm but his eyes wet. His mother, who had cried and held him too long at the train station. His younger sister, who had written him letters about her high school classes and her friends and the movies she'd seen, letters full of an innocence that seemed to belong to another world entirely. He thought about whether they would be notified of his death, whether his body would ever be found and identified, whether he would become one of those names carved into white marble in a distant cemetery, or simply one more soldier lost in the chaos of war. He thought about the men who had died around him, on top of him. Young men, most of them, who had crossed an ocean to fight in a war that was supposed to be about freedom and democracy, but which, in the moment of their deaths, had been only about bullets and blood and the terrible randomness of violence. They had expected to be heroes. They had expected to march through Europe as liberators, to be greeted by grateful civilians, to write home about their adventures, and return to parades and the admiration of their communities. Instead, they had died in a frozen forest, their bodies piled like cordwood, their last moments filled with fear and pain, and the knowledge that they would never see home again. As darkness fell, Preston began to move. It was a slow process, agonizing in its caution. He shifted his weight gradually, testing whether the bodies covering him would shift in ways that might alert any watching Germans. His wound had stopped bleeding, the cold helping to slow the flow, though the pain remained constant and brutal. He worked one arm free, then the other, pushing against the frozen corpses with a strength born of desperation. The lieutenant's body rolled away with a soft thump. Henderson's followed. Preston lay exposed now, vulnerable, staring up at a sky that was beginning to show stars through breaks in the clouds. He listened. The forest was not silent wind, the settling of snow, the distant sounds that might have been artillery or might have been thunder. But there were no human sounds, no voices, no footsteps. Slowly, moving with infinite care, Preston rolled onto his side. Pain exploded through his ribs, and he bit down on his tongue to keep from crying out, tasting blood. He lay still for several minutes, letting the pain subside to something bearable, then began the process of sitting up. The killing ground looked different from this angle. What had been chaos and confusion now resolved into a pattern he could read. Shell craters marked where German mortars had dropped their rounds. The American dead lay in clusters where they had tried to find cover or organize a defense. Equipment was scattered in ways that told stories: a medic's bag torn open and its contents spilled, a radio with its case shattered by gunfire, a line of empty brass cartridges showing where someone had made a stand before being overwhelmed. Preston checked himself for weapons. His M1 was gone, either taken by the Germans or lost in the initial assault. His pistol remained in its holster, a Colt 1911 that he drew now with numb fingers. He checked the magazine's 7 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. 8 bullets. He had no additional magazines. His combat knife was still strapped to his web belt. He had no food, no water, no medical supplies beyond the small first aid kit that every soldier carried, and which was woefully inadequate for the wound in his side. He began to search the bodies of his comrades. It was grim work, made worse by the fact that he had known these men, had shared rations with them, had listened to their stories about home. But sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. From Kowalski, he took a canteen that was still half full, the water frozen but able to be melted. From Davis, he retrieved a chocolate bar and a packet of cigarettes. From the lieutenant, he took the map, hoping it might show him a route back to American lines. He found 3 additional magazines for the M1 that he no longer had, and a single fragmentation grenade that had somehow not been collected by the Germans. The systematic pillaging of the dead revealed something else: the Germans had been equally thorough, but not thorough enough. They had taken obvious valuables, weapons, documents, but they had missed small things, items overlooked in the fading light, or judged not worth the effort. More importantly, they had assumed all the Americans were either dead or captured. They had not posted guards. They had not remained in the area. This suggested they were part of a mobile unit, perhaps a reconnaissance battalion or a Kampfgruppe pushing forward as part of the larger offensive. They had completed their mission and moved on, but they would return. Preston understood this with certainty. The Germans would come back to this position, because it was tactically significant high ground overlooking an approach route, with good fields of fire. They would establish an observation post here, or use it as a rally point, or simply pass through again on their way to other objectives. And when they came back, they would find the bodies had been disturbed. They would know someone had survived. Preston studied the map by starlight. The ink had run in places where blood or melted snow had soaked the paper, but he could make out enough to orient himself. Butgenbach was 3 miles to the southwest. American lines, or where American lines had been 2 days ago, were roughly 4 miles to the west. Between him and safety lay territory that might or might not be controlled by the Germans, forests and fields where patrols could be encountered at any moment. Roads that were almost certainly being used for German supply columns. He began to walk, moving slowly through the darkness, staying within the tree line, avoiding open ground. Each step was an exercise in pain management. His ribs screamed with every breath, every movement. His feet, which had been wet and cold for days, were now completely numb. He couldn't feel his toes at all, which worried him because it might mean frostbite, which might mean amputation if he survived long enough to reach a hospital. But these were concerns for later. Now, there was only the next step, and the step after that, and the slow progression through a hostile landscape toward the hope of friendly forces. He had travelled perhaps a mile when he heard the vehicles. German trucks grinding through the snow in low gear, their engines labouring, their headlights bouncing off trees as they navigated the rough forest roads. Preston went to ground immediately, pressing himself flat beneath a fallen log, covering his face with snow-dusted pine branches. The convoy passed within 100 yards, 6 trucks, probably carrying infantry, escorted by a Kübelwagen and what looked like an armoured car. They were moving east, which meant they were repositioning, likely in response to American counterattacks that Preston knew must be developing. The Battle of the Bulge had been raging for a month. The initial German success was already being blunted by American resistance and by the arrival of Patton's Third Army from the south. After the convoy passed, Preston remained motionless for another 20 minutes, counting slowly to himself, using the methodical passage of numbers to control his fear and his pain. When he finally moved again, it was with even greater caution. The presence of the convoy meant he was well behind German lines, probably deeper than he had realized. The distance to safety was not measured in miles, but in the probability of encountering enemy forces at every turn. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening to grey, then to pale blue streaked with clouds. Preston found himself on the edge of a clearing where several farm buildings stood: a barn, a small house, an equipment shed. No smoke rose from the chimney. The buildings had that abandoned look of structures caught in the path of armies. He approached carefully, his pistol drawn, scanning the windows for movement. The snow around the buildings was churned, and tracked vehicles had been here recently, and soldiers had dismounted and walked around. German soldiers, based on the tread patterns of their boots visible in places where the snow was protected from fresh falls. The barn door hung open. Inside, Preston found evidence of recent occupation: discarded ration tins, cigarette butts, a stack of wooden ammunition crates marked with German script. More importantly, he found a wool blanket and a torn section of canvas tarpaulin. He wrapped himself in the blanket, pulled the tarp over his shoulders as an additional layer, and allowed himself to rest for 30 minutes in a corner of the barn, his pistol in his hand, his ears alert to any sound. He was deep in enemy territory. He was wounded and exhausted. He had 8 bullets and 1 grenade. By any rational assessment, his chances of survival were minimal. The smart thing, the thing every instinct screamed at him to do, was to find a place to hide and wait for the American advance to overtake his position. Burrowing into a haystack or a root cellar, making himself invisible, and simply outlasting the German occupation of this area. But Preston did not hide. Instead, as the day wore on and he forced himself to keep moving, he began to plan something else entirely. The rage had been building in him since he lay beneath the bodies of his friends, since he heard the casual laughter of the German soldiers moving through the killing ground, since he understood that the men of his platoon had been murdered not in combat, but after they had been rendered harmless, the wounded crying for mercy and being shot, the prisoners taken not to be treated according to the Geneva Convention, but to be interrogated and likely executed. This was not warfare, as Preston understood it. This was something darker, something that violated codes he had thought were universal among soldiers. The war had been explained to him in training as a fight against tyranny, against an ideology that threatened freedom and democracy. These had been abstract concepts, words that officers used in speeches and that propaganda posters illustrated with symbolic imagery. But lying in that frozen forest, Preston had understood them differently. Freedom meant the choice to surrender and be treated humanely. Democracy meant the belief that individual human life had value beyond its utility to the state. The Germans who had murdered his wounded comrades had demonstrated they believed in neither. As night fell again, Preston found what he was looking for, a small German outpost established in and around a crossroads inn. The building was 2 stories, with thick stone walls that would provide protection against small arms fire. 3 trucks were parked nearby, their canvas covers dusted with snow. Smoke rose from the chimney. Light showed in several windows, yellow and warm against the darkness. Preston watched from a tree line 100 yards distant, counting the soldiers he could see moving past windows or stepping outside to smoke or relieve themselves. He counted 19 men. Far too many for a frontal assault, even if he had been healthy and properly armed. But Preston was no longer thinking like a soldier conducting a military operation. He was thinking like something else, something shaped by cold and pain and rage into an instrument with a single purpose. He waited for the camp to settle for the night. Lights were extinguished one by one as guards were posted, and the rest of the men bedded down. 2 sentries made circuits around the building, walking the perimeter in opposite directions so they would pass each other twice during each rotation. It was good security practice, the kind of thing veteran soldiers did automatically. But it also created a pattern, and patterns could be exploited. Preston moved like a ghost through the darkness, using the techniques he had learned in training but perfected by necessity. He kept low, moved during moments when natural sounds whined through trees. Distant artillery would mask any noise he made. He circled wide, approaching from the rear of the inn where the shadows were deepest. The first sentry passed within 10 feet of his position, so close Preston could hear the man's breathing, could smell the tobacco on his breath. Preston let him pass. The second sentry was younger, less alert. He walked his post with the mechanical movement of someone going through motions without real attention, his mind elsewhere. Perhaps he was thinking of home. Perhaps he was simply tired after days of combat operations. Preston stepped from cover behind him, one hand clamping over the German's mouth, the other driving his combat knife up beneath the man's rib cage, angling toward the heart. The soldier stiffened, tried to struggle, but Preston held him with strength born of desperation, feeling the life go out of him in a series of shudders. He lowered the body gently into the snow, retrieved his knife, took the soldier's Car-9 8K rifle and the ammunition pouches on his belt. The first sentry was due to pass this position again in approximately 3 minutes. Preston waited, the rifle at his shoulder, sighted on the corner of the building where the man would appear. When he did, Preston shot him through the head. The report of the rifle was shockingly loud in the night silence. The German dropped without a sound, his helmet clattering against stone. Preston was already moving, running in a crouch toward the trucks, the rifle slung over his shoulder, the grenade in his hand. He pulled the pin, released the spoon, counted 2 seconds, and threw it through the open back of the nearest truck. He was behind cover when it detonated, the explosion tearing through the canvas cover and setting the vehicle ablaze. The fuel tank caught with a secondary explosion that sent a fireball climbing into the night sky. The inn erupted in chaos. Men were shouting, stumbling outside in various states of undress, trying to understand what was happening. Some grabbed weapons. Others simply ran toward the burning vehicles, their instinct to fight fires overriding tactical sense. Preston shot 3 of them with the rifle, working the bolt action smoothly between shots, his muscle memory taking over even as his conscious mind was elsewhere. A German officer emerged from the inn's front door, pistol drawn, trying to organize his men. Preston shot him twice, the second bullet unnecessary but satisfying. The remaining Germans were seeking cover now, returning fire toward muzzle flashes they could see in the darkness. But Preston had already moved, circling toward the inn's side entrance, using the burning trucks as a light source that destroyed the German's night vision while leaving him in relative shadow. He fired the remaining rounds in the rifle, then dropped it and drew his pistol. 2 more Germans went down as they attempted to flank his last position. A machine gun opened up from a second-story window, tracer rounds arcing through the night, but Preston was no longer where they were aimed. He breached the side door of the inn, his pistol leading. The interior was dim, lit by firelight coming through windows and by a few candles that had been knocked over in the chaos. A German soldier was reloading his weapon at a table. Preston shot him in the chest. Another appeared from a doorway, rifle raised. Preston's bullet caught him in the throat, and he went down choking on his own blood. The building was a maze of small rooms and narrow hallways. Preston moved through it with methodical violence, clearing each space, his pistol barking in the confined quarters. He found 3 Germans huddled in what had been a kitchen, their weapons stacked against a wall, their hands raised in surrender. Preston shot them anyway. The rage that had brought him here did not allow for mercy. They had shown none to his comrades, and he would show none to them. The machine gun was still firing from upstairs, though it had shifted targets, apparently engaging shadows or phantom threats. Preston found the staircase, narrow and steep. He reloaded his pistol with his last magazine, 3 rounds remaining. He ascended slowly, his back against the wall, his breathing controlled despite the fire in his ribs. At the top, a short hallway led to the room where the machine gun position was established. Preston could hear 2 men talking frantically in German, could see the muzzle flash illuminating the room with each burst. He had no grenades left. He had 3 bullets. The smart thing would have been to wait them out, to let them exhaust their ammunition or make a mistake. But Preston was far beyond smart decisions. He stepped into the hallway and fired twice at the man feeding the ammunition belt. Both rounds hit, and the German collapsed. The gunner swung the weapon around, but the space was too confined, the barrel too long. Preston shot him in the face at a distance of 6 feet. The inn fell silent, except for the crackle of fires and the moans of wounded Germans. Preston moved through the building methodically, checking bodies, ensuring none of the enemy remained alive to threaten him. He found the officer's map case and papers. He found supplies, food, medical equipment, ammunition. He found a list of names, which he assumed were prisoners, though he had no way to read German fluently enough to be certain. As dawn broke, Preston stood outside the burning inn, surrounded by the bodies of 19 German soldiers. He was swaying on his feet, his wound bleeding again, his uniform soaked with blood both fresh and frozen. The rage that had sustained him through the night was draining away, leaving only exhaustion and pain. But he had done what he set out to do. He had avenged his platoon. He had proven something, though he wasn't certain what or to whom. An American patrol found him 3 hours later, collapsed in the snow a quarter-mile from the inn, hypothermic and delirious. They evacuated him to a field hospital, where surgeons removed a rifle bullet that had fractured 2 ribs and lodged against his spine. He spent 3 months recovering, first in Belgium, then in England, then finally back in the States. The army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross and recommended him for the Medal of Honor, though that recommendation was quietly declined by higher command. There were aspects of the action, the shooting of prisoners, the single-minded pursuit of vengeance, that did not align with the image of heroism the military wanted to project. Preston didn't care about medals. He had done what needed doing. But in the years after the war, in the long decades when he tried to return to a normal life, Preston found himself thinking often about that night. Not about the violence, though the violence came to him in dreams, but about what he had learned beneath the bodies of his dead friends. He had learned that ideology was not abstract. Freedom was not just a word used in speeches. Democracy was not merely a system of government. They were things worth fighting for because their absence created the conditions for atrocities. The Germans who murdered wounded Americans did so not because they were inherently evil, but because they had been shaped by a system that devalued human life, that treated individuals as expendable components in service to the state. Preston had played dead and lived. Then he had killed 19 guards at dawn. But the real story was not about the killing. It was about what came before the moment when he understood that some things were worth dying for, and that understanding gave him the strength to survive. The frozen forest had been a classroom where the curriculum was taught in blood and cold. The lesson was simple but profound. Freedom exists only as long as men are willing to fight for it, not as an abstract concept but as a concrete reality measured in the dignity afforded to prisoners, in mercy shown to the defeated, in rules of war observed, even when observance is costly. The snow had covered the bodies of his platoon, had covered the killing ground, had covered the evidence of murder. But Preston had emerged from beneath that covering, had exacted a price, had demonstrated that some things could not be buried or forgotten. The guards he killed at dawn were not just individual soldiers. They were representatives of a system that had to be opposed, that had to be defeated, not for revenge, but for the principle that human life held value beyond its utility to power. In the end, Preston returned to Indiana, to the steel mills, and the ordinary life he had left behind. He married, had children, grew old. But part of him remained in that frozen forest, beneath the weight of the dead, learning the lesson that would define him. Freedom was not given. It was taken, held, defended. Democracy was not a state of being, but a continuous act of will. And sometimes, the price of these things was paid in blood and cold, and the terrible knowledge that survival required becoming something you never intended to be. The forest is still there, green now in summer, white in winter, its trees growing tall over ground that was once soaked with blood. The inn is long gone, rebuilt or abandoned to the elements. The soldiers are buried in distant cemeteries, their headstones marking lives cut short by ideology and violence. But the lesson remains, taught again and again, wherever freedom is threatened, wherever individuals stand against systems that would reduce them to numbers and functions. Preston played dead and lived. Then he killed 19 guards at dawn, and in doing so, he proved that one man, armed with purpose and willing to pay the price, could make a difference in a war where millions died. The snow falls still in the Ardennes. It covers the ground each winter, pristine and white, as though nothing had ever happened there. But beneath that snow, the earth remembers.